Last but not least, on our panelists list, Ms. Theresa Fallon, Senior Associate with the European Institute for Asian Studies. The floor is yours.
So I'm in the lucky sixth position. I think everyone has covered things so comprehensively. Thank you, first of all, to the German Marshall Fund and the Aspen Institute. I'm delighted. This is my first time in Bucharest and in this amazing building. So thank you very much for your hospitality. And playing on your theme of winter, the Russians have often said their best weapon was general winter. So we know throughout history, General Winter has saved them from Napoleon, from the Nazis, and now what will happen with Ukraine this winter? So we'll have to see. Since there seems to be, and since I'm based in Brussels, there seems to be a great black hole of how did we get here? How did the European Union come up with these kind of awkward organization? So I'll step back a little bit just to be different from the other speakers. During the Soviet period, there was never a single disruption of exports of gas to Europe. The first one, as you mentioned, 2006, 2009, had tensions with Ukraine, and now we're worried maybe there will be a repeat this winter. So when the new member states, which I know is not PC, you're not supposed to say new member states in Brussels, but I think you get the picture of the newest or the newer members that joined the EU. Such a high percentage of them were 100% dependent on Russian energy. And when I ask people why, when you had the accession agreements, when you had to make them reach certain levels of economic, human rights, they had all these different agreements. It takes a long time to harmonize the rules. How come no one looked at energy and said, maybe 100% reliance on Russia isn't such a good strategic decision? And people tell me it wasn't even on their radar because Russia had never, ever turned off the energy. Now, US is neighbor to Canada. Canadians are very nice people, but I wouldn't recommend any country like the US to become 100% reliant on Canada for a thing. Just strategically, it's not a good idea. So I think they got off to a bad start, and it was a lever that Russia could use to its great advantage. But at the time as well, to give credit, there were so many other issues that the energy issue wasn't, they were more concerned about developing these economies, and it would have been very expensive at that time to diversify away from Russia. So this is kind of a blind spot. And with the European Commission, there have been peaks and valleys. I mean, it depends what's going on in the energy market. When prices get very high, people demand that the EU do something about it. And when they come low, they're like, oh, let the market reign. So there's kind of these peaks and waves in how active the EU should be. Because the EU actually doesn't have a prerogative for energy. That's a member state. That's up to the member states. But under the new President Juncker, you might have, he's the President of the Commission. He has come up with a new organogram, and we're all excited about it in Brussels. So instead of having 28 commissioners representing the 28 member states, he's proposed 7 project teams representing primary priority areas for the Commission to pursue. And interestingly, one of them is energy security. So this is the first time energy security has gotten such a high priority for the Commission. So this is, I think, an interesting sign. What the real question is, what will be the fruits of this? Will there really be an outcome? So Bratusek will head the Energy Union team. Now, when you have 28 member states, the Eastern European members, as people have pointed out here, are far more reliant on Russia than, say, Spain. Spain's practically an island, when it comes to energy security in Europe. It doesn't really, it's not hooked up to the Russian grid. I mean, it doesn't really rely so much on Russian gas. So you have different member states having different vulnerabilities and different interests. So it's very, very hard to get and shape policy with 28 different groups. All right. And with the president of the council, which is Tusk from Poland, and he has changed, originally there was a shift, there was a discussion of energy solidarity, that great word solidarity for the Poles. So then people were upset by that, so he changed it to gas solidarity to make it very, very clear that gas is what they're interested in. And there's also an interesting angle here about Iran. Iran could certainly come into play here because Europe is trying to negotiate with them, and if Iran came on board, it would change the whole picture dramatically. I know there are a lot of difficulties to overcome, but Iran is something that the EU is definitely looking into for future energy supplies. Okay. In regard to LNG, I'll just pick up on your point. with the TTIP negotiations, the Transatlantic Trade and Partnership. So it's the bookend of the TPP in the Pacific. And during the early negotiations, it was leaked that the Europeans want to claw in US gains from the shale gas revolution, which is a bit ironic, as you said, since they did not want to develop their own resources, but they wanted to try to claw that in the TTIP negotiations. And in the US, these are private companies, so it's not that the US government could actually demand that they sell gas at a certain price to the Europeans. So I think this really isn't going to fly. Now, if Europeans want to pay the market price for this, I'm sure US exporters would be very interested in selling it. Right now, Asia is the most preferred destination for LNG exports because they're willing to pay the highest price. In regard to your earlier question about negotiating East versus West, Gazprom officials love to use this. If you don't like our price, Europe, we will go to Asia and sell our gas to Asia. And I mean, people have written books about this. I mean, Bobo Lo wrote a book about this axis. And it's completely surreal. It doesn't, the fields that they tap to export gas to Europe have nothing to do with the fields that would be tapped to export to China. In fact, China made it very, very clear that they wanted brand new fields so nobody in Europe would feel that China was taking their gas. So there's a very clear distinction. It's not that this gas that could have gone to Europe is actually going to China, but it's brand new, greenfield development that will go to China. So this was a technique that the Russians used to great effect to make the Europeans nervous about prices. So, trying to make sure I pick up on all of about Romania. Romania is quite interesting for Eastern Europe because 75% of its energy they can generate themselves, and the other 25% they rely solely on Russia. So my advice to them would be to diversify if it's possible. And this whole idea of the interconnectors, which the EU has been promoting to improve the situation. The problem is Romania isn't surrounded by anyone who's actually producing energy. And so they're producing energy, so the interconnectors could actually take the energy away from Romania and send it to other member states. So the interconnector is a good idea, but I mean, in reality, the question of pressure, who's going to pay the costs? Because there's this one idea that the Russians are rather upset about, that gas imported from Russia will be shuttled through the interconnected system and be sent back to Ukraine in case there's a cutoff, and this way the EU will support Ukraine. So Russia says, you have no right to do that, and the question is, who's going to pay for that gas? So it's a nice idea in theory, but the reality is about the gas pressure, and also who's going to ultimately pay for that. And there's an interesting Romanian angle here as well, because China might be entering the market here in Romania with the purchase of Enel. Enel is leaving its share of a Romanian business, and China is actually quite interested in buying it. So it's interesting to see how these different players might be coming into the Romanian market. So overall, the EU has been rather, people had mentioned earlier that the EU should use their toolbox, things that they've already passed to break the monopoly of Russia. But my view also is that I don't think that they can cut it off one more time, because that would be the last nail in the coffin for Russia. They really won't be able to do that. Russia has been very careful to try to, the South Stream project is just a new pipeline, but it's from the same place, it's from Russia. So this diversification of supply is rather odd, because it's all coming from Russia, but maybe through different pipes. When I talked to people in Brussels, they said if the decision had to be made again about Nabucco, the decision might have turned out differently instead of South Stream. So there has been some re-examination of this. But Russia has been very, very good at lobbying officials. I spoke to Commissioner Oettinger, and he told me out of every 4 people that he speaks with, only 1 of them has a real interest. The other 3 are lobbyists representing Russian interests. So there's a great deal of lobbying going on inside Brussels there's a lot of pro-Russia policies there, just because over time Russia has created a lot of interests, and even before the sanctions were implemented, two Russian companies, Russia bought two energy transmission companies in Germany just at the deadline of the sanctions. So there's a great deal of gray area in this. So to sum up, back in 2009, after Russia had cut off the gas to Ukraine, there was a video, and you can still see it on YouTube, of the Russian military choir singing a song about how happy they were to be able to do this. And they were singing the song, and it was in Russian. I didn't get all of it, but I could figure it out when I saw the big valve. And they were turning the valve and like showing how patriotic they were and how proud they were able to do that. I don't think they could ever do that again. But thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We now have about 10 to maximum 15 minutes of questions and answers, unfortunately. So I would really invite you to open up and to ask a question, but please direct it at one of the members of the panel so that we can at least pick 3 or 4 questions from the audience. There's one question over there, sir.
All right? Yes. Thank you. Ms. Fallon, you just brought China in. If I heard it well, you are the only panelist that actually brought China into Europe in the energy field. The others focused basically on Europe and Russia. I'm Doro Costa, I'm Romania's ambassador to Beijing. So this is why it caught my ear. If I may, I quote, "The cooperation between China and Central Asian countries has grown into the largest trading partner, China that is, of a number of Central Asian countries, with the trade volume rapidly surging and the cooperation mechanism continuously improving. It is particularly so in the field of energy." A little bit lower in this paper, the two sides are uniquely complementary in resources, market, and technology. And China is financially abundant and is in the phase of rapidly increasing foreign investment, unquote. Energy. The question, which is directed to you and to Mr. Alim from the Asian Bank particularly, as well as to Ambassador Royce, if I may. How do you see the meeting between EU and China in Central Asia energy-wise? Meeting, not clash. Thank you.
It would be great if you kept your answers very crisp and sharp so that we could pick another question or maybe other 2 questions from the audience.
I'll try to keep it short and sharp. When I referred to China before, it was about the negotiating techniques used by Russia, using China as an example. But there's a very clear example of competition because Russia, as we know, had monopoly control of the pipelines from the former Soviet Union, and Turkmenistan, which would export gas to Russia, Russia would export it to Europe and charge much, much more than the Turkmens ever got. So the Turkmens were kind of getting a raw deal, and they knew this, but they were afraid of Russia. So there were take-or-pay contracts about a year and a half ago, if I'm correct or remember correctly, a year and a half to 2 years ago, and with the decline of the European economies, they couldn't use this gas. So with a take-or-pay contract, you actually have to use it, or you pay for it no matter what. So the Russians were just had this backlog of gas from the Turkmenis, and somehow the pipeline just exploded. And the Russians are like, we have no idea, so we can't pay you for the gas since you're not exporting it. Guess who was there, just waiting? The Chinese. The Chinese signed an agreement with the Turkmens. That was the last straw for Turkmenistan. They built the pipe. The Chinese were in there. They built at record pace a pipeline from Turkmenistan to China. So that gas, in theory, could have gone to Europe. So the Chinese needed it. Turkmenistan is very rich in energy resources. They got a good deal. Russia was kind of giving them a bad deal. And China was very rapid in there without anyone making having time to influence them and make them change their mind. So I think there is some competition there, but also China, I mean, that's the building blocks of every economy is the energy sector, and China will be very interested in investing in that in Europe because that could be a lever of influence. So that's my comment. Thank you.